one of the things that I found really interesting about the nature of telepathy with these children is, again, the way that it might vary from one to the other. It did seem that the more nonverbal they were, the more clearly telepathic they were with a wider range of people. And if they had a little bit of language, they might only be telepathic with, like you said, someone that they were very close to, like a parent or a teacher. But the other thing was, as these parents, teachers, family members became aware of these children's telepathy, they also became more telepathic themselves. They
Or
began to recognize the communication coming telepathically from those children and then could acknowledge it and open to their own gifts.
Mhm. Which is very much like mediumship.
Yes.
It
Yes.
it's a subtle shift. Welcome to Soul Explorers with your hosts, Gary Langley and Sally Taylor. Welcome to Soul Explorers. Today, Sally and I have a little different show for you. We're going to talk about the telepathy tapes. If you don't know what the telepathy tapes are, you're in for a treat. Sally, hi.
Hi, Gary. It's fun to kind of do just a little one-on-one this time around. And yeah, you and I have both now listened to a podcast that became actually a number one podcast for a period of time in the US. I don't know if it still is, but they've had their first season go through and they've got another season that will be coming out. But the Telepathy Tapes is a podcast that was done by a woman named Kai Dickens. She became aware of nonverbal children with autism that parents and teachers began to recognize were telepathic. And they realized it because they were able to teach these children to communicate through something called a letter board. And once they could communicate through the letter board, they were able to then give really incredible evidence that they truly were telepathic and fully consciously aware of their interactions with their families, their loved ones, all along. For a long time, these kids had been considered maybe not fully functioning mentally with full mental capacity, just because their bodies didn't work to full capacity and they weren't verbal. And so they may have been treated like toddlers most of their lives. But it turns out not only are they in there, but they have some amazing skills.
The accuracy rate of their being able to telepathically choose numbers, random numbers, and words, phrases, is phenomenal. It's phenomenal.
Phenomenal. High 90% to 100% accuracy. And that's just incredible, which again, a really good, hard, strong evidence that these kids have this, we'll call it a psi ability. I mean, I think it's just a human ability that most of us have forgotten that we have access to. And we've never been taught to access it. But these kids come by it naturally. Uh, why do you think that is, Gary? What is it about these particular children, young adults,
Well,
that gave them access?
I think that they are never fully entered the body. It's like they've got one foot in, but they're actually operating on planes that are beyond the physical. And
Right.
that's evidenced by the fact that so many of these children, unconnected, different parts of the country, knew about a place called the Hill. The Hill is a non-physical place where they meet and communicate with each other. And when you hear somebody on the West Coast say, well, yeah, I go to the hill. I think there was one child or young person who called it something else, but the rest of them all referred to the hill. Um, and it's very fascinating because they have abilities that we're only scratching the surface of. And it's been suspected for a long time. And I think something is going on the planet right now that is allowing us as people to begin to open up to some of those abilities in ourselves. And in
I agree.
fact, one of the most stunning comments from the telepathy tapes for me was there was a child who said, what we are is what you're becoming. That doesn't mean autistic, of course. That means
Right.
what abilities we have, you're moving into that. So it's like the new human, so to speak, where we realize we're all interconnected and that we can communicate non-verbally and be in different places. Out of body experience is an example of that. So,
Yes. And, your comment about them maybe not being fully embodied is something that they actually said. There was one or maybe even more of these young people who said, I didn't even know I had a body.
right.
And so part of teaching them to communicate was a process where a parent or a teacher would touch their hand just so they could become aware they had a hand.
Yeah.
So yes, I think you're absolutely spot on with that.
I was going to say eventually they were able to move away from touching them because all the
Right,
critics said, oh, well, you're cueing them. And
right,
that was not the case at all because they were still able to be telepathic without,
right.
and those abilities tended to work best with people like their family, their parents, who they were close to. Um,
Yes.
and many of them, they're such good-hearted people that they don't really fathom how we can be so negative and violent. It's just not in their wheelhouse.
Well, when you become connected on that greater level, right? They realize, and some of us as we approach that connection realize that anything negative we do to other people we do to ourselves,
Right.
because we're not really separate from each other. We're all connected at that next level up. So yeah, I it's an amazing thing. And this started as almost, I think, for the producer of this podcast to be almost just an unbelievable curiosity perhaps that she had. But as she began to see these young people in action and experience for herself what their capacities were, it opened her up
Mhm.
to more questions about the nature of consciousness. And it caused her to explore in more areas as well, even to things like the capacity of animals to telepathically interact with us or communicate with us.
Yep.
And so I loved seeing sort of this blossoming of her curiosity for the nature of consciousness and the nature of reality.
I agree. I would urge people to go listen to those tapes, the telepathy tapes, and they're on any podcast platform for the most part. One of the things I find so interesting is how validating it is to the work that we do and the afterlife. Many of these children are able to communicate with spirit. They actually
Yes,
see them. And even God, they say they can communicate with, which
right,
is that's a whole ball of wax because, well, what is God? God is everything, you know, and no thing. So I love that phrase about God. It's everything but no thing. It's
right.
not an individual like we tend to think of it in our society and our religious organizations. So. Yeah.
Yes. They do. They seem to be clairvoyant in many cases. And I'm sure like the rest of us who maybe are working on these kinds of development that they probably have as individuals, some have stronger gifts than others in different areas, right?
Sure.
But they have talked about seeing people who are no longer in a physical body, seeing their spirit bodies. They've talked about, like you said, God and angels. They've been able to be precognitive in some cases and tell about incidences that would happen in the future. So really very what we think of as traditional standard um, psychic and mediumistic abilities, but
Mhm.
they just come natural to these kids who people thought were not even fully functioning human beings.
Right. Right. Yeah, it's phenomenal. And this was originally sent to me by my nephew. He actually heard about the telepathy tapes, and then right after that, I began to hear about it everywhere. And my response to him was, well, this validates the work that we're doing. So,
Exactly.
um,
Exactly. In fact, I would say that I didn't hear any statement made by any of these young people that I disagreed with at all. I mean, like it was all spot on for what I have come to understand about the nature of consciousness, the nature of who we are at a deeper level. And so, if you want to know a little, if you want to look to a source that is, I would claim, almost unimpeachable, these kids are, for what the nature of their experience is as a spiritual being, they have so much to tell.
one other thing I found really interesting is that there were people, scientists, whatnot, that wanted to discredit or prove it was false. And they came away saying, no, these kids are really doing this. And that's also in the tape talks, which are some of the audio tapes that they put out. Of course, they're not tapes anymore, but we call them
Right.
that. So really encourage people to go and listen to those. It'll blow your mind.
One of the things that I found really interesting about the nature of telepathy with these children is, again, the way that it might vary from one to the other. It did seem that the more nonverbal they were, the more clearly telepathic they were with a wider range of people. And if they had a little bit of language, they might only be telepathic with, like you said, someone that they were very close to, like a parent or a teacher. But the other thing was, as these parents, teachers, family members became aware of these children's telepathy, they also became more telepathic themselves. They
Or
began to recognize the communication coming telepathically from those children and then could acknowledge it and open to their own gifts.
Mhm. Which is very much like mediumship.
Yes.
It's
Yes.
it's a subtle shift, but it's like you almost go into a altered reality when you're getting information
Right.
from the other side. So
Yeah. And it's evidence that it's a skill that can be developed.
yeah.
I tell people all the time that my own development, it's not because I'm unique in some way. Have I had spiritual experiences throughout my life? Yeah, I have. But I think most people do. I don't think that I'm unusual in that way. Would 15 years ago I have at all said that I had any ability to connect in these more psychic or mediumistic ways? I would have said absolutely not. I'm not that person. But when it did become something that I gained a deep interest in understanding, I also found out that you can develop. And
Mm.
there are quite a few really good mediums in the world who started out sometimes late in life with, no previous experience with having been mediumistic or telepathic or psychic. And so for me, this is just further evidence. And along with that statement that you said, that we are becoming what they are, that it is just a matter of finding the desire
Right.
to sit and open ourselves to the possibilities of these experiences. So, Gary, I happen to know, just because we're good friends, that you have been experiencing a lot of, this may not be the right wording, but new expansion, new opening
Yes.
because of just events in life. Why do you think, or how do you think that is occurring for you now, as opposed to any other time for you?
Well, as most of our viewers or some of our viewers know, um, it's been a heck of a year for me. I lost my house. I lost my animals in a fire. It was very traumatic, but it was also a release. And I love that Rumi quote that the wound is the hole where the light shines in. I think that's a really beautiful quote. Um, and what I felt afterwards was divested of everything I was attached to. It was taken away. And people would ask me, well, how are you functioning? How are you still doing Zoom groups and all of this? And I said, well, we don't really control what happens to us, but we can control how we respond to it. And I think that's really critical to realize. Um, but what do I think happened? I think it shook loose some stuck places in me because it was so devastating and it was so a wiping out of everything that I thought was my life at that point. It's 6 months down the road, and I notice, yes, my abilities to sometimes tap in. Uh, don't know if I haven't really tried to do it intentionally. It usually happens on its own, but I think that's just another step away. Um, so I think sometimes when we have tragedy, our biggest growth happens. It can be loss of a loved one, it can be a divorce, it can be losing everything you own, having your house burned down. And one thing I have to say about it is I felt like spirits had my back the whole way because if A hadn't happened, B wouldn't have happened, and C couldn't have happened. And so everything has fallen into place for me to move in the direction I want to move in now. So pretty magical when you look at it. The problem we as humans have is that we go, oh, that's a coincidence. I wonder if there really are any coincidences. I think, possibly sometimes, but a lot of times things are very clearly orchestrated for us. And if we recognize that, and I think it's really important to our growth.
Yeah. I like to restate that word now. I mean, I've talked about coincidences a lot, but really to me now, they are coincidences, right? They're these two things that happen together that
Mhm.
create deeper meaning, that create connection. And I know that I have watched over this time frame, and I do kind of hate that it requires these challenging experiences, because it was certainly the case for me as well. That sort of, like I said, gives you that crack that lets more light in. I wish it was easier than that for some people. I think that it can be. I think it can absolutely be easier than that. It doesn't require this challenging experience per se, but that tends to be the thing that sort of gives people a little kick in the butt, I guess is the way I'll say it.
Yeah.
Um, but you have handled this event in your life so beautifully. I don't know if I've said that to you yet or not, but you've handled it with such grace. And I know that it's been hard. I know that it has been life altering in reality.
As
But I have so loved seeing this sort of spontaneous opening. You've always been very spiritual. You've always been very intuitive. And I've told you for a long time now that you're a medium. You've always said, oh, I'm mediumistic, you know. Uh, but it's suddenly like it's been lit on fire. You know, and I think a lot of us are feeling that way, which brings me back to this podcast, because I think there was a specific time and place for this podcast to come into the world. Like, it couldn't have happened at another time and grabbed the attention of so many people. Do you agree?
I do agree. And timing is everything. And
Timing is everything.
these things don't happen by accident, you know. We have helpers that are nudging us in directions, and we think, oh, that was my thought. Where did that come from? Well, that might not have been your thought. It might have been a suggestion that was given to you. So you have something to say about that.
Yes, no, I just agree with when you say that might not have been, my thought. Uh, that's the way it comes. And it's a matter of people becoming aware of that,
Mhm.
that so many of the thoughts that come to us, yes, they come through the channels of our own thoughts because that's the way thoughts come. It's just a matter of beginning to recognize which of those are yours and which of those are assistance.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so I have some thoughts around this, but I want to ask you, how do you tell the difference now?
Okay, that's a very good question. Um, Sometimes spirit, and I think these are more guides, angels, whatever, that they will use a couple of methods to let me know, or at least they used to. Less now. It's more, now I feel a sort of shift in my consciousness, and then something is just there, and I'm thinking, well, where did that come from? And I've become willing enough to put it out even if it's wrong. And it's not that the message is wrong, it's that my interpretation of it could be wrong. And it's okay if it is. Just if you get something, put it out. But for a long time, they would use my name. And I never think of myself by my name. So I would hear Gary, you might want to slow down. There's a car coming around that blind curve ahead of you on the wrong side of the road. And sure enough, there was the car. Exactly. And in fact, it was so succinct. It's a gray Pinto. Now, how many gray Pintos do you see on the road anymore? Remember, they were the rolling bombs.
Right.
They would explode in an accident. Those were the ways, or they would use phraseology that I wouldn't normally use. And I'll use this as an example. There was a time when COVID was hot and heavy, and everybody around me was falling ill with COVID, including my own employees at the time. And I was thinking one day, gee, I wonder if I'm going to catch it. And the phrase that came through was, it will not come nigh your dwelling place. And I thought, what the heck is that? I don't think in biblical terminology. And then I heard kind of a chuckle, and they said, well, that's why we said it that way. So they would cue me by using my name, using phrases that I would never in a million years use.
Yeah.
Um, but now it's more of just a shift. And that may be a difference between guides, angels, and just spirit people. Spirit people
Yes.
tend to just be a shift, and suddenly something is there. And there's a feeling of urgency to put it out to the person.
Right.
Um,
Yes, I would claim, Gary, that it's a tuning,
mhm,
and the tuning to reach um disembodied, other human beings, family members, whatever, friends, that sort of thing, is actually a very slight shift. It doesn't take, you don't have to tune too far on the radio to
right.
get to them.
Mhm.
Whereas some of this, what I would call higher information, channeled information, that sort of thing, the tuning's a little bit further off of your natural tuning, you know, state. And so you do have to shift further. And
Yeah.
that's how I have become to differentiate as well. Not only what's coming in, but maybe even the nature or the level of
Mhm.
what's coming in.
Mhm.
And that's a relatively, I would say I've come to that realization within about the last year.
Mhm.
That's not something I've been aware of for a long time. But like you said, we're definitely going through changes right now, globally, socially, culturally. And things like this podcast are just perfect in our moment,
Mhm.
perfect in this time frame, because it is waking up the world on a global scale.
Right. I agree. And there is something energetically happening on the planet with all the solar activity. There are things energetically going on that, not being a physicist, I can't really describe. And nor would I pinpoint it and say, this is going to happen, that's going to happen. Trying to predict anything in the future depends on the actions of everyone as to what that outcome will be. So one changed action can make all the dominoes fall. You know, if you predicted this event at this time, very hard to do that. So, yeah. Um,
Yeah, that butterfly effect.
right. So,
Yeah, very good. Well, thank you for taking some time to visit with me. I really do want to encourage anybody who has any curiosity, any wonder about what is possible as a human being to experience in this life, in this physical world, to listen to these telepathy tapes, because these children are kind of a deeper layer of evidence than even our traditional mediums. Who, I mean, there's so much evidence; it's just overwhelmingly convincing. But for some people, the innocence of people like these young people and the experiences that they're having with their families, their teachers, and other family members around them are just, they're, like I said, they're beyond reproach in my mind.
mhm.
You have to assume there's a huge number of people who are trying to fool the world to not trust the honesty of these young people. And they even said, one of them said, you don't have these gifts if you lie,
Yeah,
right? And
I forgot about
so
I forgot about
yeah, yeah. So I really encourage anybody who's not already listened or familiar with it to check it out. We don't often promote somebody else's podcast, here, but it's such an important piece of information and important work that's being done. And like I said, I enjoyed seeing the curiosity of Akai Dickens open up to even other areas of psychic experience
yeah,
that occurred in the
yeah. And
process.
I want to encourage everyone to explore the mystery. It's fascinating. It's a journey you'll never regret. And so explore the mystery and have a great summer. And if you have enjoyed our episodes, I really encourage you to hit subscribe, ring the bell so you're notified when a new video comes out every 2 weeks. And, support us in that way. It doesn't cost you anything to do that. And it helps us immensely, helps us continue the work we're doing. So, and encourages us as well. So, I just want to thank everyone for watching. This past year and a half has been amazing doing this with you, Sally. And we'll be back with more guests real soon. So,
Bill, thanks again.
bye. Happy summer.
If you enjoyed this content, please hit like, subscribe, and ring the bell for notifications.